Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good night in the wise words of Mr. Truman. My name is Dylan Gunsolus, and my partner and I, Ian Schneider, were tasked with looking at working forest sides of easements. And due to our varying career fields, we isolated this into public and private. Ian fortunately works in the private sector and has some experience with this area. I just embarked on a career with the Forest Service, leaning in the public sector. But so my presentation is on the public side of things, and we're going to transition to Ian a little bit later, but we'll be isolating kind of the state and federal working forest easements and some of the funding that is associated with them. And so without further ado, we'll kind of dive right in and discuss what a working forest is, and I'm sure Ian will kind of double back and cover this a little bit. And I thought it was important to revisit a quote by Pinchot talking about conservation is the foresighted utilization, preservation, and/or renewal of forests, waters, lands, and minerals. And I think I obviously bolded a few keywords here, which I'll revisit in just a second, but I think another keyword that I should have bolded after reading it is foresighted. And when we foresight, we look forward to the utilization, we look forward to the preservation and the renewal of forests. We're not just using resources without planning or developing a strategic plan to maintain them. And that was one of the problems he faced in the late 1800s was everybody saw these forests as a infinite resource, and nobody really took the time to determine that these were finite and make a plan to renew these forests. And fortunately, we had him to step up. But is, he stepped up in a managerial role to kind of develop a plan to manage and sustain these forests, knowing that, yes, in a perfect world, we could have conservation and preservation for these lands, but we also need to be realistic and understand that we're going to use them. And when we use them, we need to renew them. And that's what the two definitions of working forest that I could find really discusses. And that is being carefully managed. And so the North American forest owners, as well as the Working Forest Initiative, uses carefully managed in both of their definitions, albeit they kind of enter into different terminology throughout their definition. But carefully managed being the key word. And the definition from the North American forest owners is that these forests are carefully managed to supply a steady, renewable supply of wood for lumber, energy, paper, and packing. And the Working Forest Initiative starts off the same exact way, that they're carefully managed by foresters, engineers, scientists, and harvest managers to provide a steady, renewable supply of wood for daily use. And so, although Pinchot doesn't use manage specifically, I really think this is what he was alluding to with some of the goals for organizations like the United States Forest Service and other conservation groups was that these resources need to be managed, they need to be planned, they need to be thought of to be renewed. And both of these groups being very private and not public, but I thought it was very applicable to defining the working forest. And so 70% of working forests are private, that's a statistic from NAFO, and 30% are public. And so we're looking at that sliver of 30% in this presentation. Now, when you think working forest, you're probably thinking kind of the definition I just stated, whether that's wood for lumber, energy, paper, and or packing. But working forests come with a variety of different purposes. And so that's when we talk about the types of public working forest, right? So we talk about timber production with that aforementioned definition, but we also need to look at watershed. And the United States Forest Service really talks about protecting watershed in their national forest and in some of the conservation easements that they partake in with the Forest Legacy Program. But when we talk about watershed, we're talking about forest health, and that's when we look into a research aspect of working forests. We're not just talking about timber cutting and managing that route, but managing the forest health, managing wildfire prevention, and that's something here In our ranger district that we are often looking at is the wildfire prevention. We recently conducted some thinning of trees to kind of prevent, to create fire ditches, fire trenches, and fire gaps to prevent the spread of wildfire, but also invasive pests. We have a problem in Monarch Pass with pine beetles, and we've done that thinning all the same to try to manage the pest invasion and manage those resources moving forward. Really a full circle back to the definitions we just talked about. Wildlife, of course, wildlife lives in the woods. It's pretty straightforward, and um, I hate to use the term common sense, but that's all that's coming into my brain. And, this is, we'll get into it on the next slide a little bit, but this is really state dependent, as well, as well as federal mandates things, but it's state wildlife organizations like Colorado Parks and Wildlife or South Carolina Department of Natural Resources that kind of dictate these using working forest for wildlife management. Again, managing. And I put many projects lead to sales, not just federal. And I know that sounds like an outlier, but when we understand some of the financing for these working forests, a lot of it is timber sales. So when we do clearing for wildfire prevention, for the invasive pest prevention, or any sort of timber clearing, sales can go to the state level, to a local level, to private organizations that bid on that section of forest, which we'll talk about on this next slide, looking at the state level public working forest easements. And so their goals are really differing. It really depends on the state agency. Colorado State Forest Service differs from South Carolina DNR, which differs from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which differs from Colorado State Forestry. But to isolate one of these goals of public working forest easements with the South Carolina Conservation Bank, which is not a nonprofit. That is actually a government organization. Their website is listed in my citation list. But their goal states that sorry to repeat it, their goal is to ensure our state's suitable future and economic prosperity for generations to come. And this I talk in circles a lot, so please forgive me, but this comes full circle back to that Pinchot school of thought of maintaining for the next generation. Some of those working forest definitions, managing for sustainability, a sustainable future and economic prosperity for generations to come. Now, funding for these state easements and these state projects differ vastly. And I started with tax breaks, but I'll fully circle back to that in just a second. But funding can come from the Forest Legacy Program, which we'll talk about on the next slide, as that's funding that comes from the federal side to the state. But also these land trusts, these nonprofits step up and assist in the buying, the acquisition of land, and kind of submitting that to the state, whether that is a part of the Forest Legacy Program or whether it's something separate with a separate clause. And I think it's important to note that the Forest Legacy Program only is applicable in a need area surrounding a national forest. And so if those need areas aren't really defined, then how do you enter into a conservation easement? And these nonprofits and trusts have their own avenues and their own prioritization processes that allow them and allot them to enter these easements at a state level. And so I put in funding. I know it's not related to funding, but I think it's important to mention all of these tax breaks. And I've cited Colorado Code 39 TAC 22 TAC 522, which is the Colorado Gross Conservation Easement, or GCE. This gives a tax incentive to those Colorado residents that enter into a easement with the state, with Forest Legacy Program, with a federal or a land trust. It gives them an opportunity for tax breaks. And the same thing goes for South Carolina Code 27 TAC 8 TAC 70, which is the conservation easement, which states that property must be assessed and taxed in a way that accounts for the existence of the easement, presenting an avenue for tax breaks for those and an incentive for individuals to put in into easements. And this is capped at 25% or at a max of $52,000 a year for a charitable donation on your taxes yearly. And then in 2024, South Carolina State Code 12 TAC 6, Tech 3810, which was, I put rec trail here just for notes for myself. But if you provided a recreational use trail on your land in South Carolina, you were also able to claim a tax break there as well. And this kind of ties into prioritization for the landowner, where how can we, and I'll full circle this back into this for my conclusion, but how can we, the royal we, entice landowners to enter into these easements for conservation, to enter into these easements to help protect the land moving forward? There has to be some sort of incentive. Unfortunately, money drives our society, and we need to acknowledge that. And when there's a developer coming in offering you $3 million for your land, or the opportunity for tax breaks, one hand seems a lot fuller than the other. And I'll come full circle to that later. Talk in circles, so I'm sure we'll come back to it. But prioritization for requests for easements differ by agency, right? So Colorado Parks and Wildlife is obviously going to target things that revolve around wildlife or recreation more so than agriculture or having a working forest for timber. They're going to want a working forest more for the research purposes, for the observation purposes, for the wildlife management side of things. And I think that prioritization aspect is really important to understand. And I unfortunately had an interview shortfall with the shutdown. I hate to make excuses. I believe the best excuse is the excuse not made. But I had planned to interview U.S. Forest Service officials here in Colorado, but that fell through with the shutdown. And unfortunately, my last minute reach out to Miss Ann Buckley to talk about the FLP and some of their prioritization aspects. She's the South Carolina DNR FLP representative, kind of fell through. But I think it's important to realize these agency differences for prioritization. And of course, we have to answer the partners, and I think we've already done that talking about some of the NGOs and land trusts that support these efforts. And so now it's hard to talk about state without overlapping in the federal, so we're going to rehash a lot of things here, but I thought it was important to note the United States Forest Service goal for the Forest Service Legacy Program, and I guess I want to caveat, jumping back a little bit, that the Forest Service Legacy Program isn't the only federal easement process. It's just one I wanted to isolate. If we were to try to isolate all the federal easement processes, all the state easement processes, I'd probably be here for an hour or two trying to delve in to an area that I'm not totally a subject matter expert on. But I wanted to, which we've talked about in class, the Forest Legacy Program has a goal by providing economic incentives to landowners to keep their forests as forests. We can encourage suitable forest management and support strong markets for forest products. And so that ties right into funding. The motive for the funding is to incentivize landowners to put their land into easements for the sustainment of agriculture, recreation, any other Forest Service mission or state mission to preserve those forests for the next generation, right? There needs to be an economic incentive like we visited on the previous slide. And so 75% of that funding comes from the federal level. So the LWCF, or the Land and Water Conservation Fund, has funds set aside to the FLP every year. And this is an annual appropriation, which means it's congressionally driven and is reshaped by the budget. And this is really applicable today with the federal, not the freeze, sorry, forgive me, wrong verbiage, the shutdown. So especially entering the new fiscal year, all of this funding has been halted. And you can see in the news present day, some of these energy grants, some of these other grants all being kind of kinked moving forward right now due to the shutdown. Now, the Forest Service Legacy Program and the Land and Water Conservation Fund is no different, being annually assessed and annually driven. Uh, so who covers the remaining though? If Dylan wants to put his land in the Forest Legacy Program, 75% is federal grants, but where does that remaining 25% come from? And that's where we dive right into the partners. Once again, those trusts, those nonprofits, the GOCO, the Go Outdoors Colorado, the Low Country Land Trusts, all these organizations have funds set aside to assist in that gap. And then prioritization is for the FLP specifically, is once again state driven and decided. And so there's a state point of contact for every single state. And from my brief research, there's only one per state. And so for South Carolina, it's Miss Anna Huckleberry, who I reached out to and had a privilege of talking on the phone for about 3 minutes, and attempted to schedule our interview, and I was unsuccessful. But it's driven by the state, but I feel like keywords here, that it can also be driven by some other factors. Who are the partners? What is the individual's own beliefs that's in that position? The questions I submitted to the public officials kind of had this, how do you prioritize? Because that's a question I wanted answered and I wanted to present to you. But we run into personal narratives and kind of self-motivation for the prioritization process, which is very unfortunate, and I think it should be more of a neutral approach. And so the takeaway for these public working forest easements, again, is it's really state dependent, state agency driven. There's no one size fits all for any state. And South Carolina Department of Natural Resources would differ from Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which would differ from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There would be all of these competing goals. And I think it's politically dependent, and this is a key word, I think, that you have to acknowledge that there's some sort of human element to the prioritization process, to approving any sort of easements for these lands. But one thing I wanted to full circle back to was the appeal to the landowner. And whether it's a working forest or any other sort of easement, how can we appeal to the landowner to not sell their land to a developer and lean more into an easement to have a working forest, whether that's agriculturally, whether that's utilizing for research? How can we incentivize them without necessarily money? And that's a very challenging topic to try to address. I think this week's module is especially relatable to that, with the middle class farmer and his daughter. Like, how can we write a letter to persuade him to lean more towards an easement versus selling out to a subdivision and a national level developer that has all these extenuating resources that are much more appealing than simple tax breaks or simple grants or keeping the land. Not everybody's motivated by owning their own land, and so how do we make it fully appealing to all the demographics? And with that, I truly appreciate you listening to my discussion. I apologize for being long-winded at times, but again, the public aspect of easements for working forest is a very small sliver in working forest in the country. The private sector does own about 70% of the working forest in the United States, and with that, my partner is going to cover that totally in depth, and he's got a solid interview lined up, and I look forward to hearing it. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll kind of turn it over to Mr. Ian Schneider.